This very special episode of Monster of the Week is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. Legends of the Sphinx stretch back to days of antiquity, spanning numerous faiths, cultures, and traditions. Though when a sphinx is mentioned, the first thing most people usually think of is either the Egyptian Sphinx or the Sphinx of ancient Greece. In Egypt, the Sphinx was typically depicted as a creature with a man's face and the body of a lion, often acting as benevolent guardians of ancient temples and sacred places. In Greece, however, the Sphinx was usually described as having the body of a lion, but the face of a woman and bird wings. The Grecian Sphinx was also much less chill when compared to its Egyptian cousin, asking mortals to solve a riddle and then savagely killing them when they couldn't figure out the solution. In pop culture at large, but specifically in Dungeons and Dragons, these two major ideas of what a Sphinx is have kind of coalesced into a single unified myth. Today, we think of the Sphinx as a wise and powerful being, one who guards dangerous treasure and ancient secrets, testing mortals to ensure that only the worthy find their way to such cosmically important things. And today's monster not only adds something truly whimsical and arcane to the game, but also fundamentally changes the way I look at the Sphinx, at least in D&D. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that digs up old creatures from D&D's past, talks about their lore, ecology, why they're cool, how you can use them in your game, and converts them to 5th edition, granting them a second chance at life in your campaign. Though today, we're gonna do something a little different. For our subject today is not a monster from D&D's past, but from its future. In what I can only assume was a high-stakes chase to the Wizards of the Coast office building, this creature escaped into the wild and found its way here. Even though it's not supposed to become part of the game until September with the release of the 2024 Player's Handbook, I called up WotC and said, "Can we keep it? Oh, please, can we keep it?" And after promising to feed it and make sure it got walked every day, they said yes. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to the latest member of the Dungeons & Dragons bestiary, the Sphinx of Wonder. This little guy is a really interesting creature both in terms of game mechanics and lore implications. So today, we're going to cover everything there is to know about it, and then some. The Sphinx of Wonder is a tiny creature that looks like a cat, but with angelic wings, a fantastical tail, and fur that can be described as nothing short of cosmic. Ain't he just adorable? As mentioned, this creature is set to debut in the 2024 Player's Handbook, and that probably has many of you asking a few questions. First and foremost, aren't most monsters and their stats contained within the Monster Manual? Anytime we see something like this displayed in the Player's Handbook, that tells us immediately it is somehow linked to something the players can do. For example, in our Player's Handbook at home, we have a bunch of beast stat blocks. The players need those because of the druid's wild shape ability. We also have the skeleton stat block to accompany things like animate dead. You get the idea. So the first thing I wanted to know is what player feature is this Sphinx linked to? Seeing as how this creature is CR1, the first thing that popped into my brain was the Warlock's Pact of the Chain feature, which traditionally allows you to cast Find Familiar but with an expanded list of new best friends such as an imp or pseudo-dragon. And sure enough, in the new Player's Handbook under the Warlock's Pact of the Chain, the Sphinx of Wonder appears there along with a few other new creatures as a possible option to be the Warlock's Familiar. Now, Pact of the Chain works a little bit differently in the 2024 Player's Handbook than it does in the one we already have, but this at least explains why the Sphinx is in the Player's Handbook at all, and not just, presumably, the upcoming Monster Manual. And speaking of the new Monster Manual, it's going to be the final of the big 3 new core rulebooks, which means we won't actually see it until February of next year. And that means we don't have any official lore about the Sphinx of Wonder. All we have is the Sphinx's art and its stat block, which is to be expected. But I think this little monster can tell us a lot about some of the things we might expect to see in the new D&D rules update, even without its ecology. Also, that's kind of fun, because now I get to postulate on how I think this creature might fit in with the grand scheme of things, and next year we can all come back and laugh at how stupid and wrong I am, or crown me king of the geniuses for my good and correct ideas. Either way, let's get into it. One detail that immediately struck me odd about this creature is its type. The Sphinx of Wonder is a tiny, lawful good celestial. I mean, just visually looking at the guy, it makes sense. But in 5e, the two sphinxes we already have are both monstrosities, which is honestly kind of weird. If you're not a big-time Sphinx head, the super abridged version of their lore is that every Sphinx is created by a god or cosmic being, usually a good aligned one, in order to serve two specific purposes. They guard things the gods want to keep safe, such as magic artifacts or important lore repositories, and they test mortals. Specifically, they test mortals to ensure that only worthy champions are able to access the things they guard. Sometimes this test is one of physical strength, but often it's a test of virtue, strength of will, cleverness and cunning, or all of the above. As beings created by gods to serve a divine purpose, I've always found it kind of odd that the Sphinx isn't a celestial when other creatures like the unicorn and Pegasus are. Which brings me to tinfoil hat theory number 1. It's certainly possible that the Sphinx of Wonder is some kind of unique, special, celestial Sphinx and they're a one-off monster. But I find it a lot more likely that in the new rules update, we're gonna see the idea of what a Sphinx is shift dramatically. I believe that the Sphinx is going to be rebranded as a celestial and finally join its cosmic brethren. And the Sphinx of Wonder being a celestial isn't my only reason for thinking that, because trust me when I say, I scoured the new player's handbook for clues about this. And I noticed that in the 2024 player's handbook, the Warlock subclass entry for a celestial patron specifically names a Sphinx as a type of creature you might make a pact with. So that's probably not an accident, right? It would be kind of weird if they implied you could make a celestial warlock pact with a monstrosity. That'd be like shaking hands on a really important business deal with the other person's dog. Unless, of course, we're going to see a brand new celestial reimagining of the Sphinx, which I think would be really dope. But this little Sphinx has a lot to offer beyond just being a warlock's familiar. So let's take a moment here and actually go over what this Sphinx can do. Clocking in at CR1, the Sphinx is obviously not meant to be some world-ending threat, unless you're some kind of infernal mouse, but it is a really cool monster for the lowest tiers of play and beyond. As a tiny cat with wings, it is of course going to be zipping around the battlefield with its 40-foot fly speed, easily outmaneuvering most threats. It's not physically the strongest creature in the world. I mean, it's a magical cat with wings, so I hope you weren't expecting it to be powerlifting at the gym. But what it lacks in strength, it more than makes up for with its dexterity of 17 and its intelligence of 15. This bilingual little cat can speak both common and celestial, so when you factor in a +4 to both arcana and religion, this little guy is a pretty valuable wealth of information. The Sphinx also has magic resistance, which means it gets advantage on saving throws to resist spells and other magical effects. And it's got a melee attack that punches well above its weight class. Its rend deals 1d4 slashing damage and 2d6 radiant. Assuming no other interactions, that's an average of 12 damage per cosmic paw, which pound for pound might actually be the most amount of damage possible from a familiar in a single turn. But this little guy can do so much more than just smite its enemies with radiant toe beams. It can also use a reaction called Burst of Ingenuity, which is a really cool support ability. It can only do this twice per day, but whenever the Sphinx or another creature within 30 feet makes an ability check or saving throw, it can add +2 to the roll. So if the Sphinx is acting as the familiar of another creature, it's going to be able to help not just them, but any of their friends who might be nearby to make an important roll of the dice a bit more favorable. And just as a standalone creature, that's going to give the Sphinx a nice little edge whenever it needs to make important rolls as well. It's also got 60 feet of dark vision and resistance to necrotic, radiant, and psychic damage. All in all, this little cosmic cat might be one of my favorite new monsters in the CR1 bracket, and also one of the deadliest. But small cat murder aside, I think there are tons of ways this creature could fit into a D&D campaign. So let's talk about how you might actually use this bad boy at the table. First and foremost, as I've mentioned a bunch of times throughout this video so far, it's obviously designed with being a familiar in mind. From the player side, I love the idea of rolling up a celestial warlock in a pact with a Sphinx who has the Sphinx of Wonder as a familiar and is often tasked with protecting forbidden secrets and treasures not meant for mortal hands. Unless that mortal is worthy, of course. You could play that as being the kind of character who likes to talk in riddles constantly, much to the chagrin of your party members, and you also try to make a game or a test out of practically everything. And that's just one of the ways you could play a character like that. I think there's so much potential here. The flavor is there. and it's spicy. And that could work as a player character or from the DM side as an NPC as well. And who knows, maybe then you get to a point in your campaign where the party really needs a specific powerful magic item or piece of forgotten lore, and they all look to the warlock like, hey, you want to ask your magic dad if we can borrow his holy avenger? And that naturally could lead into a thread where the warlock has to bring the party to meet their patron and awkwardly ask if they can undergo the trials to be proven worthy of what treasure it guards. As a DM, I love incorporating stuff from my player's backstory into the actual game itself, so if you can have a player-driven moment where your warlock is bringing you to meet a sphinx, that's awesome. Sphinxes are cool, and you very rarely find an opportunity to put them in a campaign. And hey, if you don't want to go all in on the Sphinx thing, they could be a really cool familiar for any warlock, or literally any other adventurer. If we look at the 5e monster manual we've already got, most of the other CR1 familiar type creatures have a variant rule that allows them to work with anyone they decide to work with as a familiar, even if they're not a magic user. I feel like this is mostly intended to be a thing that the DM can use to attach a familiar to any NPC they want to create, but I also like the idea of using this variant rule to reward a player with a cool companion in lieu of a magic item for accomplishing something. Maybe the party's even currently undergoing the trial of an Androsphinx or a Gynosphinx, and they send a Sphinx of Wonder to follow the group and report back as a little informant to keep the Sphinx wise to how the party's doing within their trial. And on that note, the Sphinx of Wonder makes a great minion for the Sphinx to employ, just in general. Maybe you've got a Gynosphinx who is the librarian of an ancient knowledge repository, like that one episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And all the little librarians who work there are Sphinx of Wonders. Sphinxes of Wonder? The little blue cat guys. Also, given their resistance to magic, ability to speak, and high mobility, a Sphinx of Wonder would be a great messenger for a Sphinx or maybe some other celestial being. Or maybe just a cool magic guy, like a high-level wizard or something. Or the Cat Lord. No, I can't go on that tangent again. And if you don't like the idea of using the Sphinx of Wonder in any of those ways, they could always be the antagonist of your game. They could choose violence. And I think they'd be really good at it. At least, for a low-level party. In the monster manual, under the entry for sphinxes, there's a tiny paragraph about fallen sphinxes that explains sometimes they grow weary of their duty and might abandon their loyalty to the god they once served. So what if we play out that scenario, but on a much smaller scale? With the Sphinx of Wonder. They could become the leader of a stray cat uprising in a busy city. Perhaps they use their magic to organize all the stray cats as minions and start a crime ring of literal cat burglars who steal magic items, which the Sphinx then uses to become more powerful. Or for something more nefarious, maybe they end up leading a legitimate underground organization, acting as the puppet master, pulling the strings and trying to overthrow the kingdom. Because remember, they can talk, and they're pretty smart. Or maybe they're not content to simply just be a Sphinx of Wonder, and they want to become something more powerful. Perhaps they start a cult, and the end goal of that cult is to amass enough arcane power to ascend the Sphinx of Wonder into the form of a true blue Androsphinx. We love a good old-fashioned god complex. And who knows, maybe because they're using different sources of magic, the end result isn't them turning into an Androsphinx or a Gynosphinx, but some new type of infernal sphinx, and it's a lot more dangerous and sinister in nature. Not only do I think that's really interesting, I also think that could very easily line up with the personality of a celestial magic cat. As the DM, I think this creature will be such a treat to roleplay as. Obviously, you're free to roleplay any NPC in your game however you want, but I think that roleplaying this little cat as a smarter than you, holier than thou, ancient in age, actual factual celestial creature would be so much fun. In other words, just play it like a cat, but they can talk. In terms of where these guys actually come from, that's one thing we don't know yet. But if they're anything like the Greater Sphinx, they are likely created by deities or possibly even created by a Greater Sphinx themselves. And this also begs the question, if you'll permit a tinge more tinfoil hattery, are there going to be other sphinxes released in the new monster manual? Up until now, the history of what a sphinx is in D&D has been pretty cut and dry. We've seen a bit of variation over the years, but most of that just kind of amounts to it's a sphinx but evil, or it's a sphinx but it lives in the forest, or my personal favorite, it's a sphinx but also a dragon. But the Sphinx of Wonder, in my opinion, marks one of the largest advancements we've seen in sphinx-based technology as far as D&D is concerned in a very long time. So Will there be more? I believe the Sphinx as a potential cast of creatures holds so much potential to be a really interesting and new addition to the game. And maybe, just maybe, this little cat is only the start of a new era in Sphinx lore for the game. But whether my dreams of a Sphinx-based economy come to pass, or it just ends up being a random one-off monster, I am super excited to see this guy in action, and I sincerely hope you find a place for this little cat creature at your game table. The Sphinx of Wonder, along with all kinds of other stuff, is going to be in the 2024 Player's Handbook, which is coming out later this year on September 17th, and it's available for pre-order literally right now. If you want to check it out, just follow the link in the description down below and lock in your copy of the new book. Now, normally this is the part of the video where I would direct you to my 5e conversion of this monster, which is available in a Google document linked in the description down below. But of course, since this monster is from a book that literally isn't even out yet, that's not gonna happen, is what I would say if I was a total hack fraud. In the description down below, you will find both the stats for the Sphinx of Wonder and a link to an NPC stat block for an alternate Sphinx of Wonder named Mankey, who is directly inspired by my cat. May he serve you well, and may it serve as inspiration for your own Sphinx of Wonder NPCs. For the cat owners in the room, definitely let me know in the comments what a Sphinx of Wonder inspired by your cat might look like. What kind of abilities would they have? What would their stats be like? I know in the case of Mankey, he's not the smartest, but he's very nice, and that's all that matters. And remember, we need to meet back here in February of 2024 to discuss how good and awesome all my theories are. Or, you know, how absolutely foolish I am once the monster manual comes out. But in either case, I'll still be here making videos about D&D monsters that I think are cool. Speaking of which, if there's a monster you would like to see in a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the comments down below or over on the Monster Suggestions channel in the Dungeon Dad Discord, and who knows, you might just see it show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week. Also, if you're Wizards of the Coast and you have monsters you want to send back from the future, feel free to do that too. And who knows, you might just see it show up on an episode of Monster of the Week. In any case, I had a ton of fun making this video. Shouts out to WotC for sending me an advanced copy of the Player's Handbook so that I could bring this weird little Sphinx guy to light. He is very cool. I love him. And I am so mad that I'm not set up to be a player in a game anytime soon because I really want to make a warlock with one of these things as my familiar. But I guess Gen Con's right around the corner, so we'll see. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one. Till then. Oh man, we were supposed to talk about goblins this week.